us now to debate the merits of moving another NHL team to Southern Ontario. In Edmonton, Alberta, Daniel Mason, Professor of Sports Management at the University of Alberta. In New York, New York, Robert Boland, Professor of Sports Management at NYU. And here in studio, Bob Stellick, President of Stellick Marketing Communications, Inc., and Brian Milner, Senior Economics Writer for the Globe and Mail. I know you are all asking right now, as I welcome you to the program, why are they doing a sports story on the agenda? Because we almost never cover sports on this program. But the reality is, this is so not a sports story anymore. It has moved into current affairs, business, economics, and so that's the approach we're going to take tonight. And to that end, Brian, I want you to start us off with some of the background here, because Jim Balsillie's efforts to get the Phoenix Coyotes to come to Southern Ontario, this is not the first time, nor the first team he's tried to get. Give us the background.
That's right. Jim Balsillie, of course, the founder of RIM, is a billionaire and figures that he has enough money to buy one of these franchises, and he indeed does. We know for sure that he had a deal to buy the Pittsburgh Penguins. He had put his money down. The deal was all set to go through, and then Gary Bettman came through with a clause late in the day saying, we'll let you buy it, but you have to promise to keep the team in Pittsburgh. Since he never agreed to do that, and since that was never his intention, he backed out at the last minute.
His intention was always to move a team to Hamilton or Waterloo or wherever.
He tried again in 2006 with another desperate team, the Nashville Predators. Made an offer. It was accepted conditionally by the desperate owner. The NHL stepped in and convinced that owner, Craig Leopold, not to do the deal, and in fact to sell to a local group that they hastily cobbled together for $40 million less than Balsillie wanted to pay. Subsequently, 6 months later, one of the investors in that group declared bankruptcy and is now facing prison for being a crook. And Balsillie tried to buy his 27%, and the local group refused to go along with that, and the court that's still up in the air someplace.
Okay. Robert Boland, tell us why the Phoenix Coyotes are in such desperate financial condition today as to make them prey for Jim Balsillie, if you like.
Well, in this case, the Coyotes have actually failed. Hockey in the desert really was never a good idea in many ways. And they're in bankruptcy because their owner took them to bankruptcy because he was hemorrhaging something in the tune of $45 to $50 million a year. As you remember, they're the Winnipeg Jets who moved to Phoenix about a decade ago, and they've really never been profitable despite the presence of Wayne Gretzky and decent teams in a couple of years.
How much money do you think the Phoenix Coyotes have lost since they moved to the desert?
Well, probably somewhere around that $240 million figure that Jim Balsillie is thinking about bidding for them. Because, again, with sports franchises, one of the more important aspects is not how much they make, but how much they appreciate over the time that they're owned. And in this case, Balsillie is actually thinking about paying above market value, at least for his bid above market value. So he would make everyone whole if he were able to acquire the team.
Now, Bob, my hunch is people cannot understand. Admittedly, this team is in a bankruptcy proceeding right now, and the judge has to make a decision. But you've got one guy who is prepared to pay $100 million more than the next guy. The next guy is the NHL itself. Why is this a complicated question?
Well, I think it's been complicated by Jim's background, as Brian went over that before. I mean, you could fast backward this up and talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the argument was they weren't viable, they couldn't make a go in Pittsburgh, and it was time to move them somewhere else, perhaps Hamilton, perhaps Cambridge. I mean, there's no question that south of the Mason-Dixon line in the U.S., there's some real issues as far as sports and hockey, as far as their ability to be viable. But, I mean, Jim Balsillie is not a guy that the NHL feels is a guy they want in their club.
Why not?
Well, I don't think he plays nice in the NHL's impression. The NHL has an impression that, he could buy this team, operate it there for a year, and then move it to wherever he wants. But he will not pay the price to get into the club, and that's what's really the stumbling block right now.
Daniel, though, if the issue is, or put it this way, one would think, common sense would tell you, that surely the better bid ought to prevail at the end of the day. If one guy's prepared to pay $100 million more than the next guy, why is there a discussion here?
I think the real issue is what you look at, what the unit of analysis is here. Is it the league that you're looking at, or is it the individual team owners that are forming a joint venture? And I think the NHL's argument is that they're a single entity that can decide where they're going to place their franchises, and they have the right to do so. So the NHL is trying to preserve their ability to make the decision to put a team in the market in the Golden Horseshoe or not. They feel it's their decision to make and not the decision of an individual owner. So I think that's really the sort of broader argument that's being made between the parties, is that does one individual owner have the right to decide what he does with his franchise or his or her franchise and move it to different cities, or does the NHL have the right to make that decision? That's really at the heart of the matter, I think. Here.
Well, I guess there's a bunch of stakeholders in this, Brian. You've got the guy who used to own the Phoenix Coyotes. You've got what the city of Glendale wants and what they feel they're owed. You've got what Jim Balsillie wants. You've got what the Toronto Maple Leafs want. You've got what the Buffalo Sabres want, because they think they're players in all of this too. Whose interests trump whose at the end of the day?
Well, right now it's clear that the league has balked at Balsillie because they don't want him to just cherry pick a franchise and move it wherever he wants. They want some control over that for financial reasons. And one of those financial reasons is that the clubs that claim the territory, in this case the Leafs and the Buffalo Sabres, would have to be indemnified in some way. They claim, at least the Leafs have claimed in legal documents, that they have a veto over who can move into their territory. The league says that's not true, and they made this case of the Competition Bureau of Canada. They said it's a majority vote, therefore there are no antitrust issues involved. If a majority of owners agree that the franchise should move, the Leafs have no say. But the Leafs say, no, that's not what we agreed to. And Eugene Melnyk supported that this week. He basically said,
He's the owner of the Senators.
He's the owner of the Senators, and he said this week that he cannot play an exhibition game in his Mississauga arena because the Leafs won't give him permission to do that.
Bob.
But if you buy any franchise, a Starbucks, a McDonald's, you get a territory with it. And I think what people have kind of blended here is the territorial issue and the issue of the financial viability of Hamilton. I mean, we're talking about Edmonton, Calgary, and Ottawa. Up until a few years ago, the U.S. teams were supporting them. They had a franchise, that they had a big market to themselves, and they weren't making a go of it with the bad Canadian dollar. To run an NHL team in Hamilton is going to cost you between $100 to $110 million a season. The Ticats run around $9 million. The entire CFL runs for less than that. I think what's happened is we've blended in this fact that it's just a layup for another hockey team to make it in Canada because we've draped the flag on ourselves. And as we talked at the top of the show tonight a bit, $150 million will materialize for a renovation on a substandard facility. There's a whole bunch of other issues beside the Leafs and the Sabres that I think are challenges to this viability.
Well, let's take a look at some of the valuations of these teams, because the money being thrown around now is just, or potentially being thrown around, is really quite incredible. Michael, if you would, this graphic here, these are the team valuations as of 2008. The winners and losers, the most valuable team, the Toronto Maple Leafs are the most valuable team in the NHL, according to Forbes magazine. The New York Rangers second, the Montreal Canadiens third. How about the least valuable teams? You've got the Phoenix Coyotes down there at the bottom, New York Islanders, and the Columbus Blue Jackets. And there are other teams down south as well that are south of the Mason-Dixon line that are having a tough time as well. Is this simply a case, Robert Boland in New York, is this simply a case of, you know, there are places hockey is just never going to sell, and there are places like up in Canada where we can't get enough of it, and should we be moving one to the other, period, full stop?
That's certainly an aspect of it. The NHL through the 1990s found that there were more American cities on the come who had built NHL or Major League quality arenas than there were teams to go around, and the NHL for a number of years balanced its budget off expansion fees from the Sun Belt of the U.S. or by relocating teams during the period of the Canadian dollar being weaker. During the lockout in 2004, that economic imbalance kind of came home to roost for the NHL, and they had to cut player salaries during that period of time and dramatically reconstitute their league to a degree. So there has been the movement to the Sun Belt, which has been largely unsuccessful. I would point to the Dallas Stars sort of being as the one exception to that one. And there's also been the aspect that hockey has moved away from the footprint where it is meaningful and moved it to a place where it's at best a curiosity at very high prices. So there clearly is that aspect that the Sun Belt has been a failure for the NHL or been a big disappointment for the NHL, and there are more American cities with arenas than there are possibly teams that could be added.
Let me follow up with Daniel on that, though. The Tampa Bay Lightning did win a Stanley Cup. The Florida Panthers went to a Stanley Cup. Gretzky completely revolutionized the interest in hockey in Los Angeles. Admittedly, this is going back 20 years now, but there's still good hockey being played out there, or interesting hockey being played out there. Can you really say, Daniel, that the NHL's Southern strategy has been a failure?
Well, to build on what Robert was saying, I think that when Bettman was hired as commissioner, he had a mandate to try and get the NHL back on network television in the United States. And so the goal was to expand the footprint. So he looked at those larger markets virgin markets for hockey and tried to put franchises there with the idea that it would make it a more desirable television product. What we see is that the teams that have been successful, at least in the short term, in those markets, are those that have been successful in terms of their competitiveness on the ice. And so I think when we look at teams like Colorado, Colorado was good from the get-go because competitively they were good from the get-go. Tampa's been well supported when the team's winning. You're seeing in Washington now, Washington was well supported in the 1980s when the team was competitive, but when the team's not competitive, there just isn't that sort of cohort of diehard hockey fans in those markets to sustain the team when they're losing. So I think that the teams, franchises have been successful in some of those markets, but only when they've been winning. And so in Phoenix, you haven't had any winning at all, really. So I think that that's the big issue, is that you can't justify a franchise being there when no one comes out to support a losing franchise or a losing team.
Bob?
Yeah, I think that's a great point as far as the winning and losing. And you talked about the Montreal Canadiens as the third most valuable franchise in the NHL. They could not find a Canadian owner for the Montreal Canadiens, you know, until recently. Yeah. In the 90s, George Gillette with a great arena, and the Montreal Canadiens weren't performing well on the ice. And I think that valid point is very much that the ebb and flow of hockey is very much related more to winning and losing than most of us would like to see.
The reality, though, is that, Brian, this sport is a curiosity south of the Mason-Dixon line, right? They don't breathe hockey like we do up here.
They don't. In fact, it's a curiosity even in some places that are north of the line. Apart from the original 6 teams, hockey is not embedded in the culture in a lot of these places. In places like Columbus, Ohio, I mean, they had minor league teams there for years, but college football, even college hockey, is much bigger than professional hockey in these cities. And that hasn't changed. What I find interesting is in your list of values, there have been studies showing that another Southern Ontario team would be no worse than 3rd or 4th most valuable on that list just because of its location. And that's because the market is actually huge. And when you look at a city like, an area like New York, which supports 3 franchises, one, the Rangers are the most valuable in the United States. One, the Islanders are one of the least valuable. Why is that? Because the Islanders play in a dilapidated arena. And they don't get enough television revenue. But that's all it takes to fix those franchises.
Well, you mentioned New York, and let me go back to New York. Robert, I want your view on your sense of whether hockey could be supported in Hamilton. We heard Bob Stellick say that the arena needs a huge facelift. It would take $100 to $150 million to bring that arena up to NHL standards. He's not convinced the team could survive there. What's your view?
I think that hockey probably could survive there. It might have some greater long-term impact on the Buffalo Sabres. I don't think it has a great territorial impact on the Maple Leafs, and I think one of the reasons the Maple Leafs are so valuable is they have the biggest hockey market in North America all to themselves. I don't think this would take away from their footprint terribly or really hurt them in the area of sponsorship or ancillary revenue. So I do think hockey could succeed there. I'm not sure it would be the 3rd most valuable franchise, but it certainly wouldn't be at the bottom. And certainly Toronto seems to me to be capable of supporting 2 teams in its general geography.
Daniel Mason, what do you think?
I think in today's economic climate, yes. I think that we have to keep in mind that the Canadian dollar is strong right now, and the Canadian franchises are driving revenues for the NHL. And it wasn't that long ago that the dollar was 62 cents. And so I think that when the dollar was low, there were only 2 teams, there are 1.5 teams. Montreal wasn't doing that great, but only the Leafs were sort of a strong franchise during those economic conditions. So I think that right now, as Canadians or as hockey fans, people are saying, well, this is great. We should be moving teams back up to Winnipeg or to Quebec or to Hamilton, but we don't know how that's going to play out when the economy's not doing that well.
Bob, let me get you to follow up on this, because the fact is Copps Coliseum can seat whatever it is, 17,000, 18,000 for hockey. It's not a state-of-the-art arena, but it's a good arena. There's a lot of interest in hockey in Hamilton. This is a big market. People would come from all over. How can you be so and with a salary cap in place, they don't have to spend 3 or 4 times as much as the next guy to win. They're all going to be basically spending the same thing. Why are you so down on its prospects?
I'm not down on Hamilton. I'm just saying I'm down on the fact that it's a lot tougher than people think. And if I was moving a franchise in Southern Ontario, a second franchise, I would move it to Toronto.
Where?
Well, you can build an arena. You could go to, I mean, you can't go to Maple Leaf Gardens because Loblaws controls that, but the point being you could play out of the Air Canada Centre as a second franchise. The sport has moved into a corporate realm. Over 80% of tickets are held by corporations. Does Hamilton have the nut for the regular person working in Hamilton to pay $100 to $150 per ticket per game? I'm skeptical.
Brian, how about you?
Well, I think it would work because I think it would draw the same business community that the Leafs do. I think that, especially the fact that there would be a new team, probably with lower prices than the Leafs managed to charge, and there are still waiting lists for Leaf season tickets. Now, it's true that cities that don't have a lot of head offices do tend to struggle. That's Nashville's big problem in the States. But Hamilton still has access to these head offices. It's not that far from the Toronto-Buffalo corridor. It's going to attract them. And the fact is that it might be wise if the Sabres moved there and played half their games there, because financially they'd be better off.
I see you nodding your head, Robert.
I'd argue that the greater long-term impact on any NHL team is probably on the Sabres, who are a more marginal NHL market than it is on the Maple Leafs. And actually, I agreed with the guest who said that probably the best move for a team is actually into Toronto. But Hamilton probably would be an interesting geographic split of the difference, I would say.
Now, Daniel, let me follow up on this issue of indemnification. If, in fact, the Coyotes come to what is seen as a protected market, protected by the Buffalo Sabres and the Toronto Maple Leafs, what kind of a check would a new owner have to write in order to move into that territory?
Well, you'd think that the league would take into account the value of the franchise as an expansion franchise. So what do you think an expansion fee would be for a team in Hamilton or in the Greater Toronto area? And so I think that the NHL would take that into consideration, and Balsillie's taking that into consideration. I think the bid that he's putting in for the Phoenix Coyotes is not under market. He's putting a bid in that's what he feels the value of the franchise is in Hamilton. And so I think that it's difficult to say. I think that obviously the Leafs and the Sabres are going to hold out as much as they can. I think that the Sabres are the ones that are going to get hurt the most by this. And so in the past, you've had indemnification fees where they sort of broken it up a little bit. I think when the New Jersey Devils relocated from Colorado in the early 80s, you had even the Flyers came to the table asking for an indemnification, as well as the Islanders and the Rangers. And so I think it would probably be designed or would reflect different values depending on how the NHL sees each market being damaged. But I would think that the Sabres would probably be the ones that would need the indemnification fee more.
Because they're on financially trickier ground than the Maple Leafs are, obviously. Give me a number, Bob.
Well, I mean, if historically you look at when Anaheim came in the league, 50% of the franchise fee was considered a payment to the LA Kings for an infringement. So if we look at a $240 million value on the franchise, perhaps $120 million. But the part is, Jim Balsillie doesn't want to pay that fee. Jim Balsillie doesn't want to fix his arena up. He wants the taxpayers to fix the arena up, and he wants the Leafs and the Sabres to kind of say, come on in. Welcome to the club. Welcome to our backyard. And I think that's not the way it should work.
Brian?
Well, there are other creative ways around this problem. When the Major League Baseball decided to move the Montreal Expos to Washington, and Baltimore said, sorry, that's our territory now, you can't do that, they worked out a compromise whereby basically Washington ceded all of its television rights for a while to the Baltimore Orioles, and Baltimore gets to broadcast Washington games for whatever they're worth on cable, and certainly Leafs TV could benefit from the same kind of deal.
Do you think there's a number out there, and Robert, I'll put this to you, do you think there's a number out there that the Leafs have in mind that would allow them to say, okay, we'll take this team in Hamilton, we'll accept it?
I think there is a number that could turn them around, but I'm thinking that as some of the other guests have said, that's probably around the expansion franchise fee of $300 million roughly, and that would be in addition to what Balsillie would be paying in the bankruptcy court for the franchise. So that would make this prohibitively expensive. Balsillie's testimony on what a relocation fee should legitimately be, or the damage of the territorial infringement, has been around $10 million. This is the one place where I tend to agree with the NHL's numbers. I think it's more in the $100 million plus range. So there's a wide gulf between the two parties here.
Yeah, I think for $11 million, the four of us could try and scrape together some money and do this.
Well, Daniel, while you've got the floor, Daniel, talk to me about this, because the Maple Leafs have had this turf all to themselves for quite a long time. And I think most people would come to the conclusion that if you put a National Hockey League team in Hamilton, it would be good for the Ontario economy. Are the Leafs at all concerned about being seen as a business entity that is acting against the interests of the Ontario economy?
Well, there's two issues there. First of all, I think that the Leafs are a bit different because the benefactors of the profits of the Leafs operations are actually good, hardworking people who's trying to get their pension, and so I think that changes things. Yes, exactly. So it's not like a cigar chomping mogul who's going to go buy another Rolls Royce with this money, right? The value of that franchise is based on their ability to generate revenues by being the only game in town, so to speak. But I think you have to be very careful when you start to make those economic impact arguments, because there really aren't that many positive economic impacts of having an NHL franchise. There's certainly public goods value where people would feel good about having a team in their city, but you can't make those economic benefit arguments that sometimes proponents tend to do when it comes to franchises relocating and building new facilities and that kind of thing.
Bob, follow up on that, because I haven't heard anybody say that bringing another hockey team to Southern Ontario wouldn't be terrific for the economy of the province. Not necessarily for the Leafs, but for the province.
Well, I use always the argument is that people, again, that my $100 million budget, if that money is coming from tourism, if it's coming a lot from people out of the local economy, great, that's benefiting Hamilton, Toronto, whomever. If it's just a redirection of money that people are spending anywhere, I think the multiplier effects often get wildly exaggerated. So
Right.
I think it's nice that Hamilton has it. I mean, Winnipeg, one of the most important things that they said when Winnipeg lost was the fact that it wasn't listed in the newspaper everywhere across North America anymore.
Exactly, that image and branding is what's important. But like, for example, if you think of Hamilton, the average person that lives in Hamilton might have $2,000 in discretionary income every year available for entertainment. So if the team comes into town, they're just going to shift that spending from what they were spending on already to spending it on the local team. And so incrementally, other businesses are going to lose business because that money's going to the new Hamilton franchise. So it's not new money. The only way you have an economic impact on Southern Ontario is if you're talking about the people who are going to Sabres games who don't go out of the country to spend their money, who stay in Hamilton or in that region and spend their money. So there's your economic impact, but you're not getting new money into town by the people who are living there already.
Brian, what's your view on the economic impact of a team in Hamilton?
Well, I tend to agree with that general direction, except we know that people from Oakville are commuting to Buffalo to watch games because they can't get tickets in Toronto, and they don't want them. Those people would be staying home. We would see more construction of things in Hamilton. There would be more of a night center in Hamilton. There would be more of a reason to stay downtown in Hamilton near that arena. Whereas if you put if you put it in Woodbridge or someplace like that, then
north of Toronto,
yeah, you just wouldn't see that kind of multiplier effect.
Because it's not a city the way Hamilton's a city. Is that
That's right, and I think if you ask the bar owners near the Air Canada Centre, they will definitely tell you that, yeah, business does seem to pick up when there's a Leaf game in town.
Robert, can you? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that makes the assumption that people don't eat otherwise, though.
Well,
So
they just won't eat down in that area. That's all.
Right. But that's what I mean, though. That's the people will go to Safeway or go to their local bars and restaurants rather than going downtown. So you're really talking about a shift in the activity, not new activity.
Well, let me find out from Robert. I mean, when New York had the Rangers had New York all to themselves for a very long time, and I guess it was what, in the 1970s when the Islanders
70s.
came in, right? And
Yeah.
then, so what's been the experience there?
Your guests are right so far in saying that new teams don't necessarily create new economic impact. But here's what an NHL franchise or any professional sports team can do. They can become the locus for redevelopment of an existing area, which the Devils certainly have become in the city of Newark, which was pretty moribund for a long time. And for the Islanders, they were a reflection of a place where New Yorkers or people in the New York suburbs were now living at the time. So it isn't so much that that they don't create new wealth, because a lot of franchises don't create as much as they're purported to, but it's also a little bit of a flat earth society thing to say that they don't create some wealth or they don't redirect into places that actually need the benefit or have the need or the infrastructure to redevelop. So for Hamilton, this team might be a key to redeveloping a convention area, redeveloping some corporate stuff, fixing some things that needed to be fixed, and it might become the lever for doing that. New York's so big, no single entity probably has that impact, but it certainly happens around the country and around North America that teams can improve where they are.
Bob?
Well, wasn't that the argument in Phoenix? They built a new arena outside of town.
But they don't like hockey.
No,
there.
well, they
like
haven't. But they have made I think Phoenix and the Leafs have been the longest right now for not making the playoffs. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't like hockey. I mean, Roger Nielsen used to joke about New York and say there were 20,000 Rangers fans and they showed up every night. I mean,
Right.
You need to get some people out there. Anaheim Mighty Ducks used to have 18,000 people in the stadium and 28,000 watching on TV. There was not a deep fan base. But I mean, is it not the opposite, perhaps, that too many of these deals have been real estate plays and not enough about real sport? And I think that's what we're getting back in this reset in the market. It's about the fan. And to your point is there that great fan in Hamilton? I think there are, but are they at that price that the NHL needs to make that nut go? When Winnipeg and Quebec left Canada, payroll was $5 million each per team Canadian.
It's $56 million.
56 million US.
Yeah.
It's a big nut. And if you say, well, we can make a go at 30 million and be less, well, then you're probably not going to win, and then we're in that spiral again of about not making the playoffs. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 sometimes.
Brian?
Well, I think that the fact is that the problem in Phoenix is not just that it's in the desert, but where they built the arena, it's the opposite side of town from where their hockey fans used to be to begin with. And if anybody who's been to Phoenix and knows the traffic problems there, nobody wants to spend 2 hours on the expressway going from their homes on the other side of the city to where this arena was built. And it was strictly built for real estate purposes. Steve Ellman, real estate entrepreneur, expected to build a lot of condos down there, a big shopping center. A lot of that didn't happen. And it was in the wrong part of town, but they had to have a new arena because the old one, which was the basketball arena in the middle of Phoenix, you couldn't see a third of the ice from about a quarter of the seats. So they had to do something, but the problem is that where they built, and they built it for political and real estate reasons, were just the wrong part of town.
Daniel, talk to me about, we got about 5 minutes to go here, and I want to cover a couple more things. I want to talk about the regulators. The job of regulatory bodies in this province is to prevent harmful monopolies from happening.
Right. If
a second team, and you're going to humor me on the thesis here, because I know you don't totally agree with it, but humor me. If a second team in Southern Ontario is good for the economy, which most folks here think it is, should the regulatory bodies have a say in this?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, I want to put it out there that I think having a second team in Ontario would be great for the economy. But I just don't think that it's going to have the type of impact that people who normally support these projects tend to suggest that they have.
Okay, but should the Competition Bureau be getting in there and making its views heard?
Well, I think, but the biggest issue is that the Competition Bureau is concerned about the sort of greater good of the taxpayer or the consumer. And so one of the problems here is that by allowing an entrepreneurial owner to move a team out from under the NHL, it's sending a message out to different cities that this is an okay thing to do. And so you had this problem created in the National Football League when Al Davis moved the Oakland Raiders to Los Angeles. The courts ruled through antitrust law that Davis had the right to move his team and the NFL couldn't stop him from moving. Well, after that, this is where you began to see this franchise-free agency where cities would build upwards of $500 million and put money to try and lure teams back and forth. So the problem here is that if Balsillie is allowed to do this, then who's to stop other entrepreneurial prospective owners from doing the same thing and luring Canadian franchises out of Canada when the dollar's not good? So it could potentially open a Pandora's box. It's definitely not in the interests of the citizens of Canada. So you have to be very careful and think about what the broader implications of this are.
So capitalism is good unless it isn't.
Unless it doesn't work for you.
That's right. It's good for some owners, but not others. I like that thesis.
You are actually absolutely right in the sense that there is a concern about Balsillie that he would be the 800-pound gorilla among NHL owners, particularly Toronto, that there wouldn't be another team in our market, but there'd be a team owned by an aggressive owner who might drive up our operating costs and force us to spend more money than we currently do.
Well, that happened in Ottawa. We all thought Ottawa was a great market. They brought in, instead of hockey people, they brought in these really smart business people, and they caused major salary escalation for the league. I mean, it was a bad deal for bringing Ottawa in under that current management. Maybe that is the 800-pound gorilla here, too. Who knows?
And I think you're raising an excellent point, and that is that perhaps we can't recognize, or we shouldn't recognize the NHL as a monopoly, but we have to recognize that the teams are so intertwined when it comes to the production of the product and when it comes to the behavior of different team owners. A decision by one general manager to overpay a player has implications for the rest of the teams in the league. And so we have to acknowledge that it's a lot more integrated than perhaps looking at it as a joint venture. So we have sort of, the reality is probably somewhere floating between the NHL's argument and Balsillie's argument.
No, it's a gray area to be sure, but I wonder, Brian, do you know whether the Competition Bureau is actively investigating this situation?
No, they're not. They were asked by the NHL for an opinion, which has no legal standing whatsoever. And they said, okay, if you want our opinion is that you can tell your franchise operators where they can keep their teams. That was expected, and it's irrelevant. The Competition Bureau is not going to step into this fight. There's nothing to be gained from it economically or politically. Ontario has a lot at stake here. But for the NHL, they should think of where their fan base really is. And it just makes no sense to me that they can cluster teams in Los Angeles, where they have 2. They can cluster them in the New York area, where they have 3, plus Philadelphia, which is only not far down the road, and have only 1 team in Toronto where they have their biggest fan base and where profits are pretty much guaranteed year in and year out, where they pursue this southern agenda for television purposes. Okay, I know Phoenix is the 12th biggest TV market in the United States. So far, the NHL has gotten bupkis out of their TV deals. They're not going to be a major TV player in the States. It's time they realize that. It's a gate-driven league. It has some decent local deals. That's what they have to pursue, and a Hamilton franchise would deliver a lot more in local revenue to the league than they can get from their national U.S. deals.
Bob, let me ask you about that. If you're an owner of an existing franchise in Canada and another franchise comes into Canada, do you have to divide your TV revenue money up with another partner, and is that a reason why they might not want another team in Canada?
Well, the Leafs, certainly when they're close in your market, I mean, the Leafs benefit from competition on that. The overall national deals are divided by 1/30th. North America-wise, so Phoenix gets the same from CBC money as the Toronto Maple Leafs do. But I think the other part that we're all forgetting too is the Leafs have sucked, and the Leafs have been terrible. And Brian Burke, if he changes that, people in Hamilton will gladly cheer for the Leafs. They have for 75 years. They're tired of a bad product. Well, and I think that's part of this mix too that we all forget.
How about this then, Robert? Maybe it'd be good for the Maple Leafs to have a little more competition for the Southern Ontario entertainment dollar, and might that just encourage them to be a little smarter?
It would certainly put a lot more pressure on them to make money and win, which they've been doing well at the first and not so well at the second over the last 7 or 8 years. They're actually kind of the typical NHL team now that's been coasting along, having previously spent more on their players. Now with the salary cap, they spend less and don't have to achieve as much and are guaranteed to be profitable. So it would definitely help them. I mean, they would be getting the guy that they think would be the George Steinbrenner of hockey in Balsillie in this group, and that's why they're afraid, I think, mostly, and why they're trying to assert this single-team veto.
Brian, my last 10 seconds here. Balsillie going to get the team?
No, it doesn't look like he will, even though the bankruptcy effort is a brilliant plan. It certainly is embarrassing the heck out of the NHL, but it's pretty hard to get a team when every other owner doesn't want you to have one.
It's a pretty exclusive club, isn't it? It is. Okay, can I thank Robert Bolden for being there on the line at New York University for us, Daniel Mason at the University of Alberta. Good to have you gentlemen along. And Bob Stellick and Brian Milner from Stellick Marketing and Communications, Inc. and the Globe and Mail, respectively, here in Toronto. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and Forbes magazine's financial rankings of the NHL teams, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's debate was produced by Meredith Martin, and you can read her post called A Tale of Two Fans on our Inside Agenda producers blog. There, both a Coyotes and a Leafs fan go head-to-head on the potential move of the Coyotes to Southern Ontario. All of that at tvo.org/theagenda.